It's 1914. World War I has broken out in Europe due to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the future heir to the throne of Austria. This 4.5-year war would eventually claim or wound over 32 million and involve over 100 countries, even though little land was won or lost. It would be forever characterized by the stagnant trench warfare that occurred. Each side, by war's end, will eventually dig at least 12,000 miles of trenches. These were often filled with water and mud, not to mention wounded and dead soldiers. Those who fought from the trenches would stand knee-high in cold, wet mud and were more likely to die of the brutal conditions like trench foot and other infections than they would from enemy bullets. Our Christmas story today is taken directly from the journal entries of some of the men that endured these chaotic conditions. It's also based off of the real historical account of those blood-stained, rat-infested trenches of death and what took place along the Western Front of this war on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1914, just 6 months after the war had begun.
October 8th, 1914. Oh, how eloquent that first letter. Written, sitting on your back, as shells whistle overhead. And how that first time in the trenches changes the hearts of men. Even the lighthearted are serious. In the blink of an eye, all is set ablaze, and suddenly we understood what our country expects of us. October 19th, 1914. We entered gaping at the slimy passageways, the appalling mazes, the gloomy trenches, the barbarically twisted web of barbed wire. Latent rockets fired off in all directions, climbed toward the darkened heavens, then beat down on the putrefied terrain. Guns howled all around us. Shrapnel ripped through mutilated trees. Bullets screaming across the parapet. We sensed the storm brewing in the suffocating atmosphere. A chill ran down our spine. October 29th, 1914. The rats. The rats are everywhere, and they tend to keep us amused. We have competitions in the trenches to see how many we can catch, and the winner is the person who collects the most corpses. It's freezing here. Very, very cold. The food isn't so great either. There are only so many cans of bully beef and stale biscuits you can eat. The lice overrun our uniforms. The only defense against them is to burn them off by a candle or match. November 20th, 1914. Today, I witnessed a disturbing scene. I was in the front lines when an enemy airplane flew overhead and dropped 2 bombs, which killed 6 men and wounded 5 others. It all happened less than 10 feet from me. The wounded had to be gotten out, which wasn't an easy task. The 6 dead had to spend the day in the trench. There are no words to describe something so sad, so disturbing. December 15th, 1914. My friend James Barron was sent to the infirmary after being in the trenches for 6 days with water up to his waist. The trench foot has overtaken him. My commander, Nat Merriam, was also sent to the hospital for exhaustion. There's no sleep here and no pleasant dreams.
Chaos and war have made their mark on humanity since Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. When they sinned, they invited upon themselves shame, guilt, toil, sickness, and even death. Sinful men gave birth to sinful men, and instead of God's creation experiencing heaven on earth, we now must endure the consequences of sin. It only takes one look at the news to see that the effects of sin have not only continued to destroy, these effects have intensified to a point of becoming suffocating to mankind as a whole. Wars, rumors of wars, genocides, domestic violence, murder, political lies, and just a general move away from anything biblically right. We went from God creating the cosmos, which means order, to mankind choosing sin, which produced chaos, which is by definition a state of disorder. No one is to blame individually. The Bible says in Romans 3:23 that all people have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's nobody who's perfect. We went from God creating the cosmos to man choosing chaos. We all know that. But we mustn't be so naive that we refuse to see this chaotic world we live in is directly connected to the sin that so easily trips us up. See, folks, if the world became sinless tomorrow, the chaos would stop. If the world quit sinning, the chaos would cease. Wars, murders, abuses to one another, the hatred and violence, the stealing, the jealousy, the gossip, the manipulation, and the tearing down of one another would stop. Our sinful nature pulls us to these things, and everyone in this room is guilty of sin. And they're also a victim of the chaos that sin creates. The disorder that exists in our world seems insurmountable, but yet there still remains a glimmer of hope. Peace. Beautiful, wonderful, amazing peace. And that peace can still be achieved, for the scripture declares where Jesus speaks. He says in Ephesians 2:14, for he himself is our peace. It's Paul talking about Jesus. He says, for he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has taken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. There is hope. There is a peace to be had. And in our story today, with the unbearable stench of death and the sure effects of chaos overcoming them, they also still had a glimmer of hope.
My dearest Gwen, it has been so long since I have seen you, and I do miss you in the littles. How I long to be home, away from the chaos of the battles which I find myself in. To sit in front of the hearth and reading stories to the children would be a glimpse of heaven to me. As I wrote before, there has been little serious fighting of late. The first battles of the war left so many dead that both sides have held back until replacements could come from home. So we have mostly stayed in our trenches and waited. But what a terrible waiting it has been, knowing that at any moment an artillery shell might land and explode beside us in the trench, killing or maiming several men. And in daylight, not daring to lift our heads above ground for fear of a sniper's bullet. Through all this, we couldn't help feeling curious about the German soldiers across the way. After all, they faced the same dangers we did and slogged about in the same muck. What's more, their first trench was only 50 yards from ours. Between us lay no man's land, bordered on both sides by barbed wire, yet they were close enough we sometimes heard their voices. Of course, we hated them when they killed our friends, but other times we joked about them and almost felt we had something in common. And now it seems they felt the same. Just yesterday morning, Christmas Eve day, we had our first good freeze. Cold as we were, we welcomed it, because at least the mud froze solid. Everything was tinged white with frost, while a bright sun shone over all. It was the perfect Christmas weather. During the day, there was little shelling or rifle fire from either side, and as darkness fell on our Christmas Eve, the shooting stopped entirely. Our first complete silence in months. We hoped it might promise a peaceful holiday, but we didn't count on it. We'd been told the Germans might attack and try to catch us off guard. I went to the dugout to rest. Leaning against my box, I must have drifted asleep. All at once, my friend John was shaking me awake, saying, "Come and see. See what the Germans are doing." I grabbed my rifle, stumbled out into the trench, and stuck my head cautiously above the sandbags. I never hoped to see a stranger and more lovely sight. Clusters of tiny lights were shining all along the German line, left and right, as far as the eye could see. "What is it?" I asked in bewilderment, and John answered. And so it was. The Germans had placed a Christmas tree in front of their trenches, lit by candle or lantern like beacons of goodwill. And then we heard their voices raised in song. This carol may not yet be familiar to us in Britain, but John knew it and translated, "Silent night, holy night." I've never heard one lovelier or more meaningful in that quiet, clear night, its dark softened by a first quarter moon. When the song finished, the men in our trenches applauded. Yes, British soldiers applauding Germans. Then one of our own men started singing, and we all joined in. In truth, we sounded not as nearly good as the Germans with their fine harmonies, but they responded with enthusiastic applause of their own and began another, "O Tannenbaum, O Tannenbaum." Then we replied, "O come all ye faithful." But this time they joined in, singing the words in Latin. British and German harmonizing across no man's land. I would have thought nothing could be more amazing, but what came next was more so.
English, come over. You no shoot, we no shoot.
There in the trenches, we looked at each other in bewilderment. Then one of us shouted jokingly, To our astonishment, we saw two figures rise from the trench, climb over their barbed wire, and advance unprotected across no man's land. One of them called. I saw one of our men lift his rifle to the ready, and no doubt others did the same. But our captain called out. It was at this point when time began to move at a snail's pace. It seemed as if it had stopped altogether, and no one dared take a breath as we anticipated the captain's response.
Must have been a pretty amazing thing to be at that spot when that happened in history. What a risk to leave chaos behind. For the first soldiers to step out of those trenches and expose themselves to certain death, the chaos must have been so unbearable that the mere thought of peace superseded the concern for their own lives. What a lesson for you and I here today. How long will we let the chaos in our own lives chart our whole course? How long will we give the control of our lives over to the chaos that we find ourselves in? To move past it always requires risk. You see, Christmas is the time of year that we stop and remember and we celebrate the birth of Christ. Christ's arrival was the advent of peace. How can this be true? This elusive, emotional state in which all is well and love just flows from everyone around you, peace. How many have ever just wanted peace so bad you were willing to do anything to get it? Life had just gotten so chaotic, or the situation, circumstances you were in got so crazy that you were just crying out from your heart for peace. I think we've all been there. Maybe family going through difficult circumstances, maybe a death in the family, maybe a sickness, maybe it's job-related or work-related. I don't know what your chaos might be, but we've all been in a place where chaos has just been so prevalent in our lives. that we couldn't wait for peace. Where is it? Got to find it. The Jews were awaiting a Messiah that would bring to their nation, they would bring their nation into such a political power that peace would be the result. They, however, looked for world domination through this promised Messiah, a domination that would position their nation in such a way that no one would dare defy them. Peace. You know, we always look at things through our own human eyes, don't we? We don't see the big picture sometimes. It's exactly what happened to the Jews. They were looking for a Messiah that would give them power that nobody would dare defy them. Then there would be peace. They could have peace in their world. And Isaiah prophesied about Jesus nearly 700 years before Christ was born. Isaiah 9, chapter 9, verse 6 says, "For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." This is odd, however, because if Jesus was truly the awaited and promised Messiah, why did he say in Matthew 10:34, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword"? We talk about Jesus being the Prince of Peace. I've talked about it this morning quite a bit already. And yet Jesus himself said, "I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword." The answer is simple, though. If the Prince of Peace is not received, then the Prince of Peace cannot rule over your life. Jesus can bring peace to the individual, but until the whole world declares him as Lord, the peace that he offers won't be universal. This receiving Christ personally on an individual level involves risk, a walking away from what we know, a turning from the chaos in which we have entrenched ourselves. Chaos is a funny thing. We hate it. We complain about it. It constantly tries to destroy us. But when we have an opportunity to leave it behind and find peace, we get scared. It's almost as if we get used to the chaos, so much in fact that we learn to depend on it. The risk we feel is in letting go of the controls of our life. We think that by being in control ourselves, that we can manage the chaos. But sooner or later, that disorder in our lives begins to overwhelm us. Chaos, though it's familiar and even uncomfortable, or even too comfortable because of that familiarity, will never bring peace. It always ends in destruction. And the risk of giving him the control seems hard to take at the time, but in the end, the real risk is in never taking that risk at all. I wonder what it would have been like for those soldiers to take that risk, to step out of those trenches, those chaotic trenches that they lived in day after day, not knowing if a bomb was going to fall and blow them to bits, not knowing if their buddy next to them would just peek up and his head would be shot, maybe clean off. What a terrible, terrible place they were in. And yet that chaos, it drove them to a place where they were desperate. And they came walking out of the trenches. You know, they took that tremendous risk. They stepped out in faith. And all this because of Christmas. It's an amazing story in history. Christ himself is the Prince of Peace. And for us to experience the peace that he offers, it takes a step of faith from our own trenches of chaos and handing him over the controls.
Then something extraordinary occurred. The captain made the move out onto no man's land to parley with the Germans. Again, time slowed as we waited his return. We heard them talking, and a few minutes later, the captain came back with a German cigar in his mouth. "We've agreed there will be no shooting before midnight tomorrow," he announced, "but sentries are to remain on duty, and the rest of you stay alert." across the way, we could make out groups of 2 or 3 men starting out of trenches and coming toward us. Then some of us were climbing out too, and in minutes more. There we were, in no man's land, over 100 soldiers and officers of each side, shaking hands with men we'd been trying to kill just hours earlier. Before long, a bonfire was built, and around it we mingled, British khaki and German gray. I must say, the Germans were the better dressed, with fresh uniforms for the holiday. Even those who could not converse could still exchange gifts, our cigarettes for their cigars, our tea for their coffee, our corned beef for their sausage. Badges and buttons from uniforms changed owners, and one of our lads walked off with the infamous spiked helmet. I myself traded a jackknife for a leather equipment belt, a fine souvenir to show when I get home. As it grew late, a few more songs were traded around the fire, and then all joined in for, you won't believe it, Auld Lang Syne. Then we parted with promises to meet again tomorrow. In the morning light, the festive atmosphere that had so prevailed the night before continued. In the afternoon, there was more talking, laughing, and even a football match refereed by one of the Germans. We took time throughout the day to bury our fallen friends, German and English alike. One of the German officers even held a short service in honor of those we had buried. As the night grew close, we wondered if the peace would last, or if we would be shooting at these men tomorrow. But whatever the outcome, this day has been a most amazing sight to behold. I don't know if I shall ever see another thing like it for the rest of my days. My watch is up, my dearest Gwen. Give my love to the children and let them know that I have had a most wonderful Christmas.
There will come a day when Jesus, the Prince of Peace, will return, and he, along with his faithful, will reign and rule over the entire world. And we know this because the scriptures declare it. But until that day, he offers a peace for you, a peace that passes all human understanding. The peace that came through this historical account of what has become known as the Christmas truce was temporary. It lasted for a day in some places along the Western Front, but in other places it lasted for weeks. In fact, there were some soldiers that wouldn't fight until they were threatened by their commanding officers that if they didn't engage the enemy, if they kept refusing, they would be court-martialed or shot. This was a peace that was not commanded by their ranking officers or by governments or commander-in-chiefs. This was a peace that will forever be a picture of the peace that can only come through Christ. You know, it's an interesting thing. History bears this out, that this Christmas truce was not limited to just one specific area. It actually happened all up and down the trenches on the Western Front. There was parts where it would be here, and there would be a break for a couple miles of where people were fighting, and then the peace would pick up over here a couple miles later. And nobody knew here that the peace was happening over here. It was like a peace just broke out all along that line without even them knowing about it. It's amazing. And I believe that it was a very special moment in history, a Christmas to remember, if you will. Because in the midst of all the chaos that man had created, Jesus, on that Christmas day in 1914, showed us the type of supernatural peace that can only come through him. What about you today? Are you ready to give up the chaos and experience the peace that Christ has for you? He can be your Prince of Peace today. This year could be your Christmas of peace if you'll let him pull you from the trenches and you let him give you real life, an abundant life. You know, Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30 says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That's Jesus' words to you today. If you found yourself here this morning and you feel like there is a heavy yoke upon you, a heavy weight, a heavy burden upon you, today could be your day that you let Jesus take that off, you lay it at the foot of his cross, and you forever find a new life, an abundant life in him. That's Jesus' invitation to you. And yes, it seems like a risk, but a grave is just a trench with the ends kicked out. God offers you peace through Christ. The world will continue to go down chaos's road. That's almost guaranteed. But you can still be saved from all that today. It's just a matter of saying yes to the gift of Christ. Will you ask him to forgive you of your sins? I mean, he paid for them by hanging on the cross for you. He lived a sinless life, then died in your place, in my place, in our place, so that anyone who would call upon his name could find salvation through him. Romans 10, 9 and 10 tells us exactly what we need to do. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. Will this be a Christmas to remember for you because you finally let him take over? He is the only way. You know, I get kind of disgusted when I watch the celebrities on television from time to time. They just have this aura about them, and they even say it. There's many roads that lead to heaven. Folks, I'm telling you, as sure as I'm standing here, that is a lie from the pit of hell. There is only one way. His name is Jesus Christ. And if that makes me a bigot, then I'm a bigot. If that makes me someone who just isn't open-minded, then I'm not open-minded. I didn't make it up. Jesus is either the Lord of all or he's a liar. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father but through me. That's his words. And there has to be this moment of risk where you step, like I said, out of the trenches of your chaos and let him fill you and give you new life and take the controls of your life and guide you and change you from the inside out. John 14:6 says, Jesus said to them, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He is the only answer to chaos. No one enters heaven without choosing Christ as Lord. He is the way. And I want to ask you today, will you let him be your way? If Christmas Day can bring about a peace between the German and the Allied forces back in 1914, a spontaneous peace, then Christmas this year in 2015 can be the Christmas that brings you peace once and for all, where you can walk away from the chaos. Take the risk. Your life will never be the same, and you'll never regret it. Would you bow your head and pray with me this morning?